Sebastian Vettel will be hanging up his F1 racing gloves at the end of this season, a career that started as a one-off appearance at the 2007 US Grand Prix and ended with 53 wins in 290 starts, 4 world titles, a modern F1 legend. There are many incredible numbers surrounding Sebastian Vettel's F1 career, but there's one particular stat that for me stands above the rest. Because as far as I'm concerned, this is an unbeatable record. I could genuinely see this standing the test of time. So today we're going to look back to when Sebastian Vettel won 9 races on the bounce. The highest number of consecutive F1 race wins ever. It's the 25th of August 2013. We're going into round 11 of the 2013 F1 season. The first race after the summer break at Spa-Francorchamps. Sebastian's already leading the championship fight. He's got 4 wins from 10 races, a 38-point lead over Lotus driver Kimi Räikkönen, the team that is now Alpine. It's a nice lead for sure, but nothing insurmountable. Fernando Alonso is right up there just behind Kimi, ready to pounce. Round 10 was the Hungarian Grand Prix. Seb would finish P3, kind of got caught up behind Jenson Button in a bit of a kind of train for a lot of the race, wasn't able to capitalise. And actually that Hungarian Grand Prix was Lewis Hamilton's first ever win at Mercedes. And as we all know, that certainly wouldn't be his last, would it? So here it is, the weekend that the run began. Of course it's Spa, so of course it was rain affected in qualifying. Lap times in Q3 were over 2 minutes for everyone. The intermediates were for sure the tyre of choice. Seb managed to put it P2, couple of tenths behind Lewis Hamilton in P1. Again, just having won last weekend, things were looking pretty good for Lewis. And Seb's teammate, Mark Webber, was another tenth and a bit back in P3. As for the race, clean getaway at the front for Seb and Lewis, but then down the Kemmel straight, Seb was able to use the slipstream without DRS and slingshot past Lewis. It's pretty much a carbon copy move of the "Here comes Sebastian Vettel" move that he would go on to make at Ferrari against Lewis years later. Fernando Alonso in his Ferrari put a phenomenal P9 to P2 result into that race, and Lewis would finish P3 in the end. Round 12, Monza, and this was a pretty comfortable qualifying for the Red Bull boys. Seb put it on pole, couple of attempts ahead of Mark Webber, and P3 was Nico Hülkenberg in a Sauber, so that was a bit out of nowhere. They were anticipating wet weather for the race, but it never came. The start was pretty stressful for Seb, not going to lie. Like Mark and Felipe Massa were right on his chuff going into T1, but he was able to hold them off. And from then on, it was a pretty comfortable cruise to a race win. 5 seconds ahead of Fernando Alonso by the end and Mark Webber in third. Round 13, Singapore. And this qualifying session would go down in Folklore as, for sure, Sebastian Vettel's most famous qualifying session. You get 2 runs. You go out, put a quick time in, come back into the pits, new fresh tyres on, go out again, see how fast you can go. Seb didn't need it. He needed 1 lap. He dunked a phenomenal margin on everyone's head in that first run and only thought he'd be able to improve by a tenth, maybe 2 at best, so decided to sit out while everyone else went out again. Rosberg went P2, Grosjean in the Lotus went P3, but no one could touch Sebastian Vettel's pole position. So he was awarded pole position without even sitting in the car. He was in the garage with the team. If that's not a statement of intent, I don't know what is. As for the race, Seb did look like he got mugged by Nico Rosberg into turn 1, but the Mercedes driver carried a little bit too much pace, wasn't able to get it slowed down, and Seb retook the position. Seb did manage to build up a pretty significant lead, but then his soon-to-be teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, in the Toro Rosso, binned it, brought out the safety car, and reduced that huge lead to basically nothing. Seb had to do it all again, and that's exactly what he did. It was actually handy he didn't do a second run in Q3 because he had an extra set of super softs that he could use in the race and bring home another comfortable victory. It was another superb recovery drive from Fernando from P7 to P2. You got to wonder if that Ferrari had more qualifying pace in 2013. I think Fernando would have given Seb a lot more issues. And then Kimi Räikkönen in the Lotus went from P13 to P3 on the podium. Well done, Kimi. Round 14, South Korea. The final time we would ever go to race on the Korean International Circuit. Maybe one day it will return. I don't see it though, to be honest. Lewis gapped Seb by 2 tenths to take pole position, and it was Mark Webber in P3. Fortunately for Seb, he was able to get away very cleanly out of the blocks, took out into the distance even though he was starting P2. An absolute madness went on behind him. Felipe Massa span out in his Ferrari, a bunch of front wings got clattered. Sergio Perez in the McLaren got a puncture as well, which ended up bringing out the safety car. Mark Webber was clattered by Adrian Sutil in the Force India, which resulted in Mark's car going up in fire. And then you've got the iconic images of that Jeep fire car briefly driving around fully on track with loads of F1 cars behind it. It was very disconcerting at the time. Seb was unfazed by all of this going on around him, converted to P1, P2 and 3 were the two Lotus boys as well. It's easy to forget just how competitive that Enstone-based team had made themselves in 2013 because, you know, Seb ran away with this title. But there were stories throughout the grid and the Enstone one was a pretty good one. Round 15, Suzuka, Japan, just 1 week later. And you know what? Credit again to Mark Webber. They'd fixed his burnt out car from the weekend prior, put it back together, and he took pole ahead of Seb by about a tenth and a half. Lewis Hamilton in his Mercedes would be starting P3. Now Romain Grosjean had put it P4, and this must have been the start of his career. He absolutely slingshotted up the inside, took P1, left Hamilton, Vettel and Webber looking like a right bunch of mugs. And actually Red Bull started pretty poorly. Seb would fall down to P3 off of the start, with him and Lewis tripping up over each other, and actually Lewis coming off a lot worse with a puncture. This could quite easily have ended Seb's run here. Red Bull put Mark on a 3 stop, Seb was on a 2, so Mark was coming like the clappers at the end, but didn't have enough time. Grosjean held him up enough to stop him challenging Seb's lead in the race that he eventually retook. So that meant it was Vettel P1, Webber P2, Grosjean P3, Fernando Alonso P4 meant the championship wasn't quite wrapped up, but we were getting very close to that point because round 16 was India, which looked like it was going to be the race where Seb would wrap up his 4th championship on the spin. And in qualifying, he dunked over 3/4 of a second over 0.75 on P2 on everyone's head. On top of that, Fernando was starting all the way down in P8. He was the only man who could challenge Vettel at this stage, mathematically anyway. The two Mercedes would be starting P2 and 3. Seb did a good job off the start, holding the silver arrows at bay, and unfortunately for Fernando, he got caught up behind Webber, behind Seb's teammate. He hit him. He also had contact with Jenson Button at the start as well. That small chance of fighting for a championship looked gone because Fernando had to pull into the pits to replace his front wing. Seb did have to pit really early in this race because he'd started on used softs and was asked by the team, basically, you've got to make up positions on track. And this was Seb in a 2013 Red Bull. So that was no problem. He was P17 after his first stop, worked his way all the way back to P2. It was actually really sad luck for Mark Webber, and not for the first time in this 2013 season. He had tons of technical gremlins, but Seb was lucky to not be on the receiving end as well. Mark's engine went pop when he was running P2 in this race. So that was it. Seb took the race win. Fernando finished all the way down in P11, which meant it was official. He'd won his 4th World Championship title, all at Red Bull. And he did donuts to celebrate. Once again, iconic images. Round 17, Abu Dhabi. Now look, you'd be forgiven for thinking, oh, like he's won the title, you know, he can take his foot off the gas a bit and just chill and just enjoy the last few races, not put too much pressure on it. It's a nice and easy job now, Seb. And sure, in qualifying, he was actually out-qualified by Mark Webber here by about a tenth, so there wasn't too much in it. Nico Rosberg starting in P3. But as for the race, Seb certainly wasn't in the mood to stop winning. Seb and Nico both jumped Mark off the start, but Seb held on to the lead and basically drove away into the sunset. Mark Webber was able to get past Nico to recover the P2, but Sebastian would go on to win the race ahead of his teammate by over 30 seconds. This wasn't even close. You've got to say that when it comes to man and machine in Formula 1, this end of 2013 Sebastian Vettel, arguably the strongest driver-car pairing there has ever been in the sport, no doubt. Round 18, the United States. Back on pole once again by just over a tenth, so again the margins weren't that big between him and Mark Webber, but he got pole position and Romain Grosjean would start P3. Unfortunately, Webber fell back to P4 off the start, while once again Seb just checked out. Grosjean did have more pace than Seb towards the end. To be fair, in his Lotus he was catching Seb, but nowhere near quick enough to take that victory away from him. It was 6 seconds the gap in the end, so Grosjean P2, Webber P3. And this was the race where Seb gave that iconic, there's plenty of iconic moments actually after Seb won the 2013 championship, because he was doing donuts in the old Red Bull and dropped the whole, we need to remember these days, they won't last forever, which ended up being very apt as the turbo hybrid era came in. And also this win would break the all-time consecutive race wins in a row record held by Alberto Ascari and Michael Schumacher, both at 7. Seb now had 8. But of course, there was still one round to go. Round 19, Brazil. The days of an Interlagos season finale. How I do miss it. And it was this day that Seb decided to save one of his best qualifying sessions for last, gapped P2 by 0.623 seconds. That was Nico Rosberg. He was over a second ahead of Fernando Alonso in P3. And Interlagos isn't a long track. These are huge margins. Although uncharacteristically, it was actually quite a poor start from Seb this race. Nico got him into turn 1. But fortunately for Seb, he had the car underneath him to retake the position just one lap later. Didn't even need DRS to get past Nico. Into turn 1, and then the story writes itself. Mark would make his way through to P2 in what was his last ever F1 race, by the way. Shout out Mark Webber, who is currently manager of Oscar Piastri. And I mean, that's a whole separate topic, because it looks like maybe he's not going to be at Alpine next year, which is crazy. But anyway, I digress. Vettel won again. Another 1-2 as well for Red Bull. Alonso P3. This was race win number 9 in a row. Now 2 ahead of Fangio and Schumacher. Mad. 4th world title. 9 wins on the bounce. Could have been 11 if it wasn't for Hungary, where he finished P3 because he won the race before Hungary. And to be honest, if the season was longer, it was only 19 races in 2013. I see no reason why Seb wouldn't have kept winning. But unfortunately for him, that was the end of the year, and not just the start of any old new year in 2014, but a whole new set of technical regulations. The turbo hybrid era was beginning, and as we know, a team that isn't Red Bull were the ones to adjust best and run with it. To fast forward to the 2014 Australian Grand Prix, round 1, could Seb extend that consecutive race win record? It was a bit wet, it was a bit greasy on track, and Seb had a real difficult time in qualifying. In Q1, he clipped the wall, still got through, but it wasn't great. And in Q2, people were going off left, right and centre, and he just wasn't able to get in a good enough lap to get out of Q2. He was out. Down in P13 with his new teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, who'd got the call up from Toro Rosso, up in P2 in a Mercedes sandwich. And then for Sunday, it was a shocking weekend. Seb had a poor start, fell down the order, almost got caught up in a bunch of incidents, managed to avoid them all, and then had to retire through engine problems on lap 3. They were brand new power units, they were always going to go kaput, and Seb lost his exceptionally early on. This was also the race, the home Grand Prix for Daniel Ricciardo, where he finished on the podium on track, but he got it taken away from him afterwards. So not a good first weekend for Red Bull Racing. They would go on to finish that season P2 in the Constructors, but were they anywhere near Mercedes? No one was. And that was it, the run was over. And to be honest, you know, yes, Seb challenged the title in 2017 and 18 at the start of the season particularly, but I don't think we ever saw again Seb so at one with a car, a team able to give that man something that he could deliver some of the most dominant performances F1 has ever seen, which ultimately is a crying shame, because we'd see 8 Constructors titles in a row from Mercedes and no real sustained challenge throughout an entire season to the Mercedes dominance until 2021. So why, Tommo, have you labelled this video the unbeatable record? Surely anyone could win more than 9 races in a row, right? Obviously that could literally happen. Alex Albon could just win 10 in a row in a Williams if everyone else just kept crashing, you know what I mean? Like, it could happen. But do I genuinely think it's likely for anyone to win not just 9 races in a row, but 10 races in a row to take this record off of Seb? Because if these new regulations do what they're supposed to do, which is stop the big teams escaping from the little teams with the sliding development scale, with the cost cap, etc., etc., we shouldn't see golfs in car quality like we have before in F1, be that the McLaren or the Williams in the 90s, be that the Ferrari in the 2000s, be that the Mercedes or the Red Bull in Seb's era. Great drivers attract great cars, no doubt, and teams deserve to put R&D in and be rewarded for their good innovation. But for most of the history of F1, you've had the quickest cars here and the slowest cars here. The job of these regulations is just to bring that closer together, not so that everyone's the same. It's not a spec series, but just bring it closer together. And I think with the quality of drivers we've got in F1 at the moment, be that Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, Lando Norris, Fernando Alonso, George Russell, the list goes on. With the quality of drivers and these gaps, hopefully, as they should, gradually converging and coming together, the likelihood of seeing one driver in one car win 9 races in a row, 10 races in a row to take the record off of Seb, I'm optimistic that the competitiveness of F1 will improve in years to come, and that won't happen. Maybe I'm wrong to have faith in F1 and the FIA, but that's the way I feel about it. Let me know how you feel about it. Do you think this record will ever be beaten? And if so, who by? End of an era, legend of the sport, Sebastian Vettel, mate. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for watching. My name's been Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.